China. An emperor knows how to govern when poets are free to make verses, people to act plays, historians to tell the truth, ministers to give advice, the poor to grumble at taxes, students to learn lessons aloud, workmen to praise their skill and seek work, people to speak of anything, and old men to find fault with everything. Address of the Duke of Shao to King Li Wang, circa 845 BC. Chapter 23. The Age of the Philosophers. 1. The Beginnings. 1. Estimates of the Chinese. The intellectual discovery of China was one of the achievements of the Enlightenment. These peoples, Diderot wrote of the Chinese, are superior to all other Asiatics in antiquity, art, intellect, wisdom, policy, and in their taste for philosophy. Nay, in the judgment of certain authors, they dispute the palm in these matters with the most enlightened peoples of Europe. The body of this empire, said Voltaire, has existed 4,000 years without having undergone any sensible alteration in its laws, customs, language, or even in its fashions of apparel. The organization of this empire is in truth the best that the world has ever seen. This respect of scholars has survived closer acquaintance, and in some contemporary observers it has reached the pitch of humble admiration. Count Kaiserling, in one of the most instructive and imaginative books of our time, concludes that altogether the most perfect type of humanity as a normal phenomenon has been elaborated in ancient China. China has created the highest universal culture of being hitherto known. The greatness of China takes hold of and impresses me more and more. The great men of this country stand on a higher level of culture than ours do. These gentlemen stand on an extraordinarily high level as types. Especially their superiority impresses me. How perfect the courtesy of the cultured Chinaman. China's supremacy of form is unquestionable in all circumstances. The Chinaman is perhaps the profoundest of all men. The Chinese do not trouble to deny this, and until the present century, there are now occasional exceptions, they were unanimous in regarding the inhabitants of Europe and America as barbarians. It was the gentle custom of the Chinese in official documents before 1860 to employ the character for barbarian in rendering the term foreigner, and the barbarians had to stipulate by treaty that this translation should be improved. Like most other peoples of the earth, the Chinese consider themselves the most polished and civilized of all nations. Perhaps they are right, despite their political corruption and chaos, their backward science and sweated industry, their odorous cities and awful-strewn fields, their floods and famines, their apathy and cruelty, their poverty and superstition, their reckless breeding and suicidal wars, their slaughters and ignominious defeats. For behind this dark surface that now appears to the alien eye is one of the oldest and richest of living civilizations, a tradition of poetry reaching as far back as 1700 BC, a long record of philosophy, idealistic and yet practical, profound and yet intelligible, a mastery of ceramics and painting unequaled in their kind, an easy perfection rivaled only by the Japanese in all the minor arts, the most effective morality to be found among the peoples of any time, a social organization that has held together more human beings and has endured through more centuries than any other known to history, a form of government which, until the revolution destroyed it, was the almost ideal of philosophers, a society that was civilized when Greece was inhabited by barbarians, that saw the rise and fall of Babylonia and Assyria, Persia and Judea, Athens and Rome, Venice and Spain, and may yet survive when those Balkans called Europe have reverted to darkness and savagery. What is the secret of this durability of government, this artistry of hand, this poise and depth of soul? 2. The Middle Flowery Kingdom. Geography, race, prehistory. If we consider Russia as Asiatic, which it was till Peter and may be again, then Europe becomes only a jagged promontory of Asia, the industrial projection of an agricultural hinterland, the tentative fingers or pseudopodia of a giant continent. Dominating that continent is China, as spacious as Europe and as populous. Hemmed in through most of its history by the largest ocean, the highest mountains, and one of the most extensive deserts in the world, China enjoyed an isolation that gave her comparative security and permanence, immutability and stagnation. Hence the Chinese called their country not China, but Tianhua, under the heavens, or Shihai, within the four seas, or Chongguo, Middle Kingdom, or Chonghua Kuo, Middle Flowery Kingdom, or by decree of the Revolution, Chunhua Minkuo, Middle Flowery People's Kingdom. Flowers it has in abundance, and all the varied natural scenery that can come from sunshine and floating mists, perilous mountain crags, majestic rivers, deep gorges, and swift waterfalls amid rugged hills. Through the fertile south runs the Yangtze River, 3,000 miles in length. Farther north, the Huanghe, or Yellow River, descends from the western ranges amid plains of less to carry its silt through vacillating estuaries, once to the Yellow Sea, now to the Gulf of Pechili, tomorrow possibly to the Yellow Sea again. Along these and the Wei and other broad streams, Chinese civilization began, driving back the beast and the jungle, holding the surrounding barbarians at bay, clearing the soil of brush and bramble, ridding it of destructive insects and corrosive deposits like saltpeter, draining the marshes, fighting droughts and floods and devastating changes in the courses of the rivers, drawing the water patiently and wearily from these friendly enemies into 1,000 canals, and building day by day through centuries, huts and houses, temples and schools, villages, cities, and states. How long men have toiled to build the civilizations that men so readily destroy. No one knows whence the Chinese came, or what was their race, or how old their civilization is. The remains of the Peking man suggest the great antiquity of the human ape in China, and the researches of Andrews have led him to conclude that Mongolia was thickly populated as far back as 20,000 BC by a race whose tools corresponded to the Azilian development of Mesolithic Europe, and whose descendants spread into Siberia and China as southern Mongolia dried up and became the Gobi Desert. The discoveries of Anderson and others in Honan and South Manchuria indicate a Neolithic culture 1,000 or 2,000 years later than similar stages in the prehistory of Egypt and Sumeria. Some of the stone tools found in these Neolithic deposits resemble exactly in shape and perforations the iron knives now used in northern China to reap the sorghum crop. And this circumstance, small though it is, reveals the probability that Chinese culture has an impressive continuity of 7,000 years. We must not, through the blur of distance, exaggerate the homogeneity of this culture or of the Chinese people. Some elements of their early art and industry appear to have come from Mesopotamia and Turkestan. For example, the Neolithic pottery of Honan is almost identical with that of Anau and Susa. The present Mongolian type is a highly complex mixture in which the primitive stock has been crossed and recrossed by 100 invading or immigrating stocks from Mongolia, southern Russia, the Scythians, and Central Asia. China, like India, is to be compared with Europe as a whole rather than with any one nation of Europe. It is not the united home of one people, but a medley of human varieties, different in origin, distinct in language, diverse in character and art, and often hostile to one another in customs, morals, and government.